Hi, I'm Beth Wilson. I'm one of the hosts of STEM in 30, a television program for middle school students produced at the National Air and Space Museum. If you haven't seen our latest STEM in 30, be sure to check it out. It's about the Space Shuttle on its 40th anniversary. Today, during this live chat, we'll be taking your questions. So be sure to put them in the comments section and we'll get to as many as we can. Also, let us know where you're watching from and we'll try and give you a shout out. Today, we're going to be talking about the Space Shuttle program, and we're going to focus on the women who flew on it. Our guests for today are Dr. Amy Foster, professor of history at the University of Central Florida, who also wrote Integrating Women into the Astronaut Corps, Politics and Logistics at NASA, 1974 to 2004. Our other guest is Dr. Emily Margolis, curator of American Women's History, and she's jointly appointed at the National Air and Space Museum and the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Ladies, welcome to you both. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
So glad to be here.
So let's get started. Emily, can you tell us a little bit about women's roles at NASA over the years?
Great, thanks for your question, Beth. Well, I think it's important to point out that women have been contributing to aviation and space before NASA was formed in 1958. So I just like to start with that reminder because women have always been present. And so what's really interesting is that women have filled so many different roles in contributing to space exploration. We'll talk about the ways that they've served as astronauts during the shuttle era, but I'd like to point out a few things about the roles that they filled. So starting in the 1940s and 50s, when rocketry was sort of developing and becoming, making spaceflight possible, there were women who were employed with the title of computer. They often had training as mathematicians. And we know of these women computers who worked here. You have an image of computers who were working at what became the Jet Propulsion Lab in California. And because of the movie and book Hidden Figures, many of you will know about the women computers who worked at Langley, which became a NASA center in the 1950s. And so what's really important to remember is these women were called computers, but they were doing so much more than computation and calculation. It was not just plug and chug, as they might call it, with using different formulas, but it was actually required a lot of critical thinking, the use of theory and understanding, the context that the math was being used in. And as you'll notice from those pictures and also from the from Hidden Figures, that there were white women, Black women, Asian American women who were doing this work. And so that was started in the early space age, and then moving up into the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs. There were many women who were involved in various capacities. I'd love to point out Dr. Carolyn Huntoon, who joined the Manned Spacecraft Center, as the Johnson Space Center was known at the time, in 1968. She was a recent PhD and had been working on physiology, and she joined to NASA, and she ended up doing really important work on astronaut physiology and nutrition. And she ended up becoming a really important mentor to the first women shuttle astronauts, doing everything to make them feel welcome and supported, from working on the logistics to making sure that there was a women's locker room at the gym. And so she ended up becoming one of the first women to be the director of the Johnson Space Center. And so women filled all of these different roles, scientific, as well as administrative. I just love to point out very briefly a woman named Shirley Ferguson, who was the executive assistant to Kurt Debus, who was director of the Kennedy Space Center during the Apollo years. And, these are kinds of roles that are often overlooked because they're administrative work. They involve, filing papers, as you can see here from her desk. But she really contributed a lot to making sure that KSC could run. So I think it's important that we celebrate all the different roles that women have played at NASA throughout the years.
Amy, could you tell us how the shuttle program changed the look of the Astronaut Corps?
Absolutely. So when we think about the Astronaut Corps in its early days, this was very experimental flight. And so when the first Mercury astronauts were chosen, there were 7 men, but President Eisenhower had basically said he wanted test pilots to be the first astronauts, because test pilots already had been through kind of the rigors of risky and dangerous business. And so if anything went wrong in those space capsules, they would be calm and be able to handle those situations. And what that really did in just making that one qualification to be an astronaut was it cut women out of the picture, because there were no women test pilots. Most of the men who were selected but ultimately became test pilots did so through the military, and women weren't allowed to fly in the military. And so that created a disadvantage for women, coming up through the ranks. But what changed really was the shuttle. So for the first time, this wasn't a program that was driven by the space race. We weren't fighting the Soviets to be first at anything. And so kind of the whole feel of the program changed at NASA. So it stopped being about being first, and it became more about science. And when that happens, that really opens doors. As Emily said, women have been doing math. They've been in scientific roles for a very long time, even though they haven't gotten credit. So we can trace women back all the way to the ancient world working as mathematicians. But in the 1960s, you had women who were starting to get college degrees and more importantly, like advanced degrees. So a master's degree and a PhD in sciences. And that opened the door for women to really enter the Astronaut Corps, because for the first time, with that mission being about science, we had a new class of astronauts that we called mission specialists. And so these actually are the first 6 women that you see in this picture who were selected to be part of the Astronaut Corps. They were selected in 1978. And I can kind of run through the names. On the top row, you have Kathy Sullivan, Shannon Lucid, Anna Fisher, Judy Resnick, and down below you have Sally Ride and Ray Seddon. And when you look at all of these women, they're extraordinarily qualified. They all have a PhD or an MD. So Kathy Sullivan was a marine geologist. Shannon Lucid was a chemist. Anna Fisher was an ER physician. Judy Resnick had her PhD in electrical engineering. Sally Ride had a PhD in astrophysics. And Ray Seddon was a surgeon. So these are all really accomplished women. And so what they brought to the Astronaut Corps was that scientific focus that the shuttle was really meant to do. And so that opened up real possibilities for women in the space program for the first time, because, and as I kind of call it, these women had already been experienced in those pipeline careers. Now NASA wanted scientists. We had women who were scientists. We just still didn't have women yet who were pilots necessarily, and certainly not test pilots. That's going to come a little bit later. But when we open that door, up for women scientists, we have a great crew to select from, and that's how we ended up with the first 6 women astronauts.
We have a lot of people watching from Vermont, Florida, the area of Texas, and Oklahoma, Georgia, New Hampshire, Ukraine, Philippines. We have the Community Christian Academy 6th grade class in Florida. And this is being shared as part of Astronomy Week at the Maitland Public Library in Maitland, Florida. For those of you who are watching, please let us know where you're watching from. We'll try and get you a shout out. And be sure to put those questions in the comment section. We'll answer as many of those as we can. And also, if you're watching this, feel free to share it on Facebook, and so that we can get even more people watching. I want to go back.
To say, hi, Maitland. I'll be over in Altamont Springs in about 4:30 this afternoon.
All right, so you got okay. So everybody who's in Maitland, look for Amy while she's out there. You can pepper her with even more questions after this program. I wanted to back up a little bit, because there is some confusion that Sally Ride was the first woman in space. And Emily, that's not necessarily true. Can you talk a little bit about that history before we get back into the shuttle era?
Yes, thanks for that great question, Beth. So Sally Ride was the first American woman in space, and she flew in June of 1983. And so it's, looking back, thinking about the context of the history of the space program, it really grew out of this tense geopolitical relationship between the United States and what was known as the Soviet Union at the time. And so it was actually the Soviet Union who put the first woman in space. Her name was Valentina Tereshkova, and she flew in space about 20 years prior to Sally Ride. And this is a picture here. You can see she's very decorated, and she had experience with parachuting, which sort of qualified her to be sort of part of the Cosmonaut Corps.
Our next question, somebody would like to know about the new class of astronauts. I'm not sure which of you is best to answer that. So I'll start with Amy, and I'll let Emily chime in as well on that.
Sure. Yeah, the latest class of astronauts, I actually have talked about this on the radio, actually. There are 13 people. That's kind of how NASA presents them. 11 are American and 2 are Canadian, but they've been brought in together, and so they're all considered part of this latest class. What I like to point out about this class, as well as the previous class of astronauts, is we're really seeing a lot more women. This latest class of 13, 6 of them are women. And in the previous class, there were 8 astronauts selected and 4 of them were women. So when we start looking at, opportunities for women in the Astronaut Corps, we're really reaching parity. It's a very well balanced Astronaut Corps now, which is great to see because we didn't see that for a long time. Yeah, there they are. That's the latest class.
Emily, would you talk a little bit about the Lovelace women, and also known as the Mercury 13?
Yes. So, it shouldn't surprise you, given women's participation in aviation and spaceflight in various roles, that women have always been keen to travel in space. But as Amy pointed out, because of the selection criteria that NASA set in the 1950s, women were essentially disqualified from joining the early years of the Astronaut Corps. But during that same moment in time, there was a doctor named Randy Lovelace who was working in New Mexico under a NASA contract, and he was doing the physiological testing of the men who were being considered for Project Mercury. And so he took it upon himself to study women and understand if they were physiologically fit for spaceflight as well. And so working with Jackie Cochran, aviation pioneer, they reached out to accomplished women pilots throughout the United States and invited them to participate in this program. And so ultimately 13 women successfully completed the training. They had to get out to New Mexico on their own dime. Many of them, had to take unpaid leave and were let go from work. This was a real commitment that they were ready to make. But it turns out, in fact, that Lovelace had not been authorized by NASA to begin this testing program. And so when the next phase of astronaut eligibility became sort of open after the women had passed the tests, they were stopped short because they weren't able to go on to the jet training at one of the military facilities. And so as a result of this, moment in time, women's dreams were crushed. The First Lady astronaut trainees, Jerry Cobb was a member. I know we have a photograph of her. So Jerry Cobb was really keen on saying, well, why not us? So working with Janie Hart, she actually initiated sort of a congressional hearing on the status of women in space. NASA ended up giving her the title of consultant, and Jerry Cobb liked to say that she was the least consulted consultant at NASA. And so unfortunately, although their dreams to go to space weren't realized, they did prove that women were physically fit to go into space. And some of the women in the space program during the shuttle era really looked to Jerry Cobb and the First Lady astronaut trainees as inspirations and role models, as people who helped to sort of break that glass ceiling. And so I love this image so much. It's from Eileen Collins's historic mission. Eileen Collins was the first woman to pilot a space shuttle. And when she had this historic mission, she invited some of the First Lady astronaut trainees to come to the Kennedy Space Center to watch her historic launch. What I love so much about this image and this backstory is that it says, it's never too late to recognize the people that history has forgotten. I think that's just so beautiful.
And if you want to learn more about the Loveless women, Dr. Margaret Weitekamp, who also works at the National Air and Space Museum, has written a great book called Right Stuff, Wrong Sex. And you can learn a whole lot more about the women in the early space program. We've got people watching in Ohio, Maryland, California, Kentucky, Maine, Pennsylvania, New York, Texas, Oklahoma, Wisconsin, Nova Scotia, and the Kurdistan region of northern Iraq. And so keep those questions coming. The next one we have is, what advice would you give an 11-year-old girl who would like to start a career with NASA? What sort of education plan, minimum to maximum required, should she keep in mind?
NASA is always looking for engineers. They're always looking for people in the medical field. Part of what we're doing, what NASA is doing moving forward, is we're looking to go back to the moon, and we're looking to go to Mars. And one of the concerns is that of doing that is, how do we live in those environments, and how do we keep the astronauts safe? So one of the things that we take for granted about our atmosphere is that it protects us from a lot of radiation that's in outer space. And so when you travel in space, you're exposed to radiation at levels that we're normally not used to. And that can cause real health risks. Exposure to radiation ultimately can cause cancer. And so when we look at this long duration flight, that's one of the things that is a real concern for NASA in protecting our astronaut corps. So they will be looking for doctors. They're always looking for engineers. They're always looking for mathematicians. And if you want to be an astronaut, what I would say first and foremost is find one of those fields within STEM, science, technology, engineering, medicine, that you love, and pursue that, right? And the reason I say that is, what NASA is always looking for in terms of their astronaut corps is people that bring something else to the game. Everybody wants to be an astronaut. They're all going to do the astronaut part, but what else can you bring to the program? So when we go back and look at those first 6 women, they all have this science or medical background. And that's really what they're bringing to the program is, because NASA is so much more focused on science than it was in the 1960s when we were embroiled in the space race. It's what do you bring scientifically and medically to NASA that is going to promote the whole program? So be an engineer first, or be a doctor first, and then be an astronaut.
Yeah. Oh, and if you don't mind, I'd love to add to that, Beth. NASA, employs so many people who don't work in STEM fields. So if STEM doesn't fit for you, but you still are really excited about space, you can become a space historian, right? So NASA also needs people who work in their education department and does outreach and marketing, really. So there are so many different careers that can lead towards NASA. So find something that you're really passionate about and excited about, and there can be a future for you there.
I think that's a lot of the advice that we've gotten from astronauts over the years, that find something you really love to do. And I know that Kjell Lindgren has said to us on more than one occasion, the only job he would have left being a doctor for was to become an astronaut. We've got people watching from Alabama, Iowa, New Mexico, North Dakota, Alaska. Shout out to Penquist Valley Middle School. Keep those questions coming in. This is a good one. Are there any requirements to apply to be an astronaut, and how old do you have to be?
I don't know that there's actually an age limit. I think a lot of the people who get selected as astronauts are in their 30s, but that's just because of what they've done prior to that. So you do need a college degree, and that really is flexible about what it is. It still comes to, what do you bring to the program? There is still some requirements about if you're in the sciences, either to have work experience or an advanced degree, so a master's degree or a PhD. There's a medical requirement. You have to be able to pass a flight physical. So, we're looking for people who are physically fit. I think there still probably is an eyesight qualification. I probably would be disqualified for that. You can wear glasses, but it has to be, your vision has to be correctable to 20/20. I think that's still one of the requirements. And again, that's about the physicality of the job. And then one of the things that's always been kind of yeah, there you go. How to look it up. I think there still probably are some limits on height, not so much on the short end, but on the tall end. And that's true even in the military. If you want to be a pilot, if you don't fit in the cockpit, it's not going to work. So yeah, that high end, if you're 6'6", yeah, it might be a stretch, literally.
Let's talk a little bit about Sally Ride. One of the things that, one of the stories that I always liked was during their first press conference, and they started asking her whether she was a good cook or whether hard work made her cry. Do you want to talk a little bit about how the press treated her differently than her male counterparts? Emily, do you want to start off?
I'm happy to start off. I think that a lot of cultural biases that exist about sort of where a woman's place is in society were really challenged by Sally Ride's selection to, become the first astronaut in space. And so the questions that she was getting from the press were very much a reflection of those kinds of attitudes. And so I'll say it didn't just start on the day, the press conference before her launch. It started on the very first day that the Group 8 astronauts, known as the 35 new guys, were introduced to the public. And so the 6 women who were a part of that cohort, they got the bulk of the questions from the press that day. And so something that ended up being an important strategy for all of the women who were assigned to these early missions is that they looked to the other members of their group who were on their mission, who would sort of take away some of the heat and sort of inject a little bit of humor into the press conferences and sort of say, I think when someone had asked if Sally, gets emotional, in the space program, she looked over to one of her colleagues and was, and he said, I don't, I don't get emotional. So sort of like playing off of each other and like recognizing that these biases are there. But it's something that she constantly had to negotiate. And when she landed from her first mission, there's a very famous story of her, the press conference after this STS-7, and NASA gave her a bouquet of flowers and she famously refused them. And that sort of became a big hoopla in the press because, I think, to be treated differently is something that the women in the Group 8 really didn't want.
And I know that we have some photographs of Sally and her other hobbies before she became an astronaut. So do you want to, yeah, here we go. Amy, do you want to tell us a little bit about what she was interested in prior to joining NASA?
Yeah, well, as you can see, she was a tennis player. She started playing tennis when she was 9 years old. And actually was, actually quite competitive. I think she was even offered a tennis scholarship to college. Yeah, she really was very good at it. But by the time she got to college, she really started thinking more and more about the scientific work that she wanted to do. But I think it just, it just kind of reflects that she was a really well-rounded kid, right? You explore and you get excited about everything. And I think that's the way she was. I'll kind of go back to the previous question. All 6 of the women who were chosen in that first class knew they were going to be kind of targets of the press. And sometimes they just let it roll off like water off a duck's back. And other times they just got really sick and tired of it. I know there was one situation where they were in training and someone yelled like, hey, Miss Seddon, And she turned around and yelled back, "It's doctor," that it was frustrating to be constantly harangued. But they knew that was going to be part of the job. And they were also very careful then about how they went about their job. Because Sally was selected to be the first American woman to fly in space, and she was going to be working the remote manipulator arm. Oh, that's an awesome picture of her. Yeah, that's her essentially floating on the ceiling. But because she was going to be kind of working and writing protocols for how to work that arm on the space shuttle, she would sit down with the other 5 women and kind of run through those protocols to say, does this make sense to you? Would you change something? And worked on them as a team, because she understood that everything she did was going to be scrutinized, and also set a precedent. And so what her concern was, particularly with those protocols for the RMS, was when Judy Resnick, who was the second American woman to fly, came in for her flight. If she wanted to start changing those protocols, they were concerned about even having pushback from NASA going, she's just such a pain in the butt, and doesn't know what she's doing, where that wouldn't be, the men wouldn't be critiqued in the same way. So they really understood that they were really being watched. Everything they did was being judged. And as frustrating as that is, they managed it as well as they possibly could. And I think approached it in some very good ways.
Somebody has a question about the differences in equipment for men and for women, and how is that handled in space?
Amy, do you want
to go? I got this. So by and large, there's not a whole lot of difference. The flight suits are pretty standard. Basically they measure for size. One of the things that's been really difficult for women is actually doing spacewalks. And I know we have some pictures of Kathy Sullivan's, suit, and I think one of her gloves. So part of the reason that's challenging is the suits are modular. So there's a trunk that covers your torso, and then the arms attached separately and the legs attached separately, and then the gloves are separate from the arms. And that torso piece is a hard shell, so kind of like a turtle, because it's protective. And the issue is that women's shoulders aren't as broad as men's. And so when women try to get into some of these suits, they can't put their arms down. They become like the kid in A Christmas Story when he's all dressed up in the snowsuit, and he's like, I can't put my arms down. But you can't work that way. So unfortunately, it does mean that a lot of women astronauts haven't been able to do spacewalks because the suits haven't been complementary to our body shape. The only other time that different equipment comes into play is actually going to the bathroom. So one of the things that the shuttle did, and then now on the International Space Station that's being done, is urine is separate from feces. All right. So we all know those words, and I'm going to talk about them a lot. But, when we think about going to the bathroom on space, women always sit down. Men might not. So what do we do? How do we do all these things? And so the toilet has some issues, but the one thing about 2 parts of the flight, launch and landing, is you don't get to get up and go to the toilet. All right. So we have to figure out a way to particularly collect urine while you're strapped in those seats. And so this was kind of the solution, at least the attempted solution for women. What men basically wear is they have a sheath that's kind of like a condom. It's attached to a hose, attached to a collection bag. And that works reasonably well for the men, but that doesn't work for the women. So I think if we go back to that first slide, not the one of the panties, but the kind of the schematic. Yeah. So what the engineers came up with is this plastic device that is kind of broken down, that would be up against the vagina and then attached to a hose. And okay, I know I have a picture of that one, and it's blue, right? So that actual plastic piece, do we still have that image? There we go. So this was like the test device. And a woman would actually have to put that up against her vagina and then sit in a chair strapped down. And for all the girls out there, you're probably going, that would hurt a lot. Even for the boys out there who have ever ridden a bike and maybe come down a little hard, you also know that would hurt a lot. So this was like attempt number one. And the women tried it out because basically they want to fly in space. So if this is what we got to do, this is what we got to do. This ended up being scrapped. This was not going to work. And what they ended up doing is developing some special diapers. And I know we've got some image. I think, yeah, that one, Sally rides. So basically, these are like really padded bicycle shorts. And this is ultimately what they designed. And believe it or not, this design came out of something that the U.S. Department of Agriculture had been developing. And it's ultimately something that got applied to disposable diapers. So there's this gel that's actually that the USDA developed, and then when water hits it, it kind of expands. And the whole idea for the USDA is this: we can inject this gel into soil that is semi-arid, so pretty dry. And then what little water it gets, it will hold it now in place so that the roots of plants can have that water. Well, that's exactly what goes into disposable diapers, because it's like a liquid hits it and it just goes and it holds it in place. And when I talked to Ray Seddon about this diaper design, and NASA loves acronyms, so it's called the DACT, the Disposable Absorption Containment Trunks. She said she tried it out in her bathtub, and she's like, it was like sitting in a bowl of Jello, but it worked. And so this is what the women astronauts used for launch and landing, and actually what Kathy Sullivan then used during her spacewalk. And it worked so well that the male astronauts went, can we have those too? Because they just, exactly, that's it. Oh, that's nice. That's nice. Yeah. So that basically just holds it in place, and it works fantastically. And so now basically all the astronauts use it's a modified version of the containment trunks. It doesn't look like bicycle shorts now. It really just does look like a diaper. And now they have a different acronym for it now. It's called the MAG, the Maximum Absorbency Garment. But yeah, that's basically, we get that development that now all the astronauts use basically as an adjustment for the women.
Yeah, and if you go back to that slide, I'm hearing an echo. If we could go back to that slide, I will say that this was one of Marty's experiments where we did put that powder into a cup. Anne McLean, the astronaut here, was just fascinated by this. I was not sure, since it was Marty's idea, how well it was going to hold. I was ready for a head full of goo after that. But it worked. It stayed in the bottom of that cup. Emily, can you tell us a little bit about some of the stuff in our collection that is primarily, these firsts that for women, like Pam Melroy had to do something with her hair.
Yes. So, right now our museum is closed, but when we open up again, you can come and visit our collections in person. But in the meantime, we have some images of things that will be on display in a new exhibition that my colleagues and I are working on called At Home in Space, which tells the story of building and sustaining a permanent presence in space. So that includes the shuttle, it includes space stations, or thinking about Gateway moving forward. And so we have different personal effects and mementos and flight suits from astronauts. And so I would like to introduce you to the NASA-approved regulation scrunchie here that was worn by Pam Melroy in space. Pam, Eileen Collins, is one of the only two women to both pilot and command space shuttle missions. And so, there was some concern over what would happen to women's hair in microgravity. Really, anyone's hair in microgravity is kind of floating around. It looks like you've touched a Van de Graaff generator, right? And so, there is concern that longer hair would be attached to, perhaps get stuck on things. You might know this from your real life, but if this is a knob or a button or a switch that's really important, you kind of don't want to get tangled in there. And so this is a scrunchie that that Pam Melroy wore in space, and she donated to the museum. We have a few other things that you'll be able to see in At Home in Space, including the flight suit that Sally Ride donated to the Air and Space Museum after her historic mission in 1983. And so we'll just be able to sort of have these personal effects that really bring these stories to life.
There's Sally Ride's suit. So that will be on display in the museum in the next couple of years. Can we talk a little bit about what NASA did to recruit women and minorities? Amy, why don't you start?
I can go with that. So this Group 8, it was different than any other groups that came before it. So like I said before, this was the first time we had mission specialists. So people who were specifically, coming from the scientific and medical fields. But the way the selection process had worked prior to that, most of the time it was coming directly from the military. So the military would put out calls and they would do some initial screening for pilots. There was one group of scientist astronauts during the Apollo program, and one scientist, geologist by the name of Jack Schmitt, ended up walking on the moon as part of Apollo 17. But even then, it was all people who had been screened through the National Academy of Sciences. And so those pools that NASA had for selection was small. With the Group 8, they weren't, because NASA was first interested in selecting astronauts for the shuttle, which kind of changed the mission. This was also the first time they were putting these calls out for astronauts nationally. So you would find an advertisement for astronauts, on a job board in colleges. And because NASA was able to kind of change those requirements and loosen the requirements to be an astronaut, broaden them really, they wanted to get the call out widely. And initially, they only had about 1,500 applications, and that's a lot. It's a lot of applications to go through for 35 slots. But that yet wasn't representative. So it didn't have as many women applying as they wanted to, and it didn't have as many people of color applying. So what NASA ended up doing was hiring a woman named Nichelle Nichols. And if anybody is a Star Trek fan out there, if you go back to the original series, Nichelle Nichols is the woman who played Lieutenant Uhura. Yeah, that's her. And so they hired Nichelle to go around and talk at colleges to say, people, they want you. This is your opportunity. They really do want people of color. They really do want women. And that number of applications went from 1,500 to over 8,000 applications. And it's hard to say that it isn't from, the work that Nichelle Nichols did. Yeah, she's been such a proponent of the space program, and it's been wonderful. So yeah, that was really what NASA did to say, we want you. Please apply. And as a result, of 35 people who were selected, and it was 15 pilots and 20 mission specialists. We had 6 women, but we also had 4 men of color. So there were 3 African-American men and 1 Asian-American man in that group. And when I talked to Kathy Sullivan, she kind of described that group, those 10 people, as the strange ones. And that really kind of set the tone for that first press conference too. So, the press conference with all 35 of them lasted for about 15 minutes. And then the white guys were sent out of the room, and everybody else was there for another 2 hours answering questions. And it particularly focused on those 6 women. Yeah. So yeah, you can see, I'm not going to be able to find the guys. The women are kind of mostly in front. Looks like Shannon Lucid's in the back. Anna Fisher's in the back. But you had Guy Bluford, Ron McNair, Ellison Onizuka. Oh, and I can't remember the third one. Frederick Gregory. Yeah. So yeah, those 4 men started to change the look of the Astronaut Corps along with those 6 women.
I do want to give a shout out to Mrs. Cox's second grade class at Clear Lake Elementary in Oregon. Thanks for watching. I think I'm going to wrap up with this final question, and this is sort of a follow-up on the Nichelle Nichols and another first. Emily, can you talk a little bit? I know that Mae Jemison was inspired by Nichelle Nichols. Can you talk a little bit about Mae Jemison and her legacy?
Yes, that's a wonderful question. So Dr. Mae Jemison was the first African-American woman in space. She joined NASA in the late 1980s. She's trained as a medical doctor. And so, she really credits Sally Ride and Guy Bluford, who was the first Black man in space, really for opening up the doors and saying, like, this is really possible. And also credits sort of Nichelle Nichols for offering that inspiration. And what I really appreciate about Nichelle Nichols' role here is that, science fiction is how a lot of people engage with space before they even get into the STEM classes. And so this was such like a beautiful marriage of recognizing how STEM can inspire science fiction, but at the same time, science fiction can inspire people who are interested in STEM. And so Dr. Jemison flew on one Space Shuttle mission, and she has been active in the sciences ever since her retirement from NASA. So she's had a very long career.
She has, and she has been to the museum, and she's just a wonderful speaker. If you ever get a chance to hear her, I encourage you all to do so. Ladies, thank you so much for joining us today. We have run out of time. I have a few reminders that you all can find this video. It will be available both on Facebook and YouTube after the live chat. Be sure to watch our latest STEM in 30, which is 40 years of the Space Shuttle. It features numerous NASA astronauts and their stories, as well as some really fun hands-on demonstration that you can do at home. Next week's live chat will focus on Earth Day and light pollution. And we all hope that you can tune in next month for our next STEM in 30, which will focus on careers in the aerospace industry. And we're going to cover a whole lot of things, not just pilots and astronauts. If you enjoyed this program, as always, be sure to give STEM in 30 follow on Facebook and Twitter, and subscribe to the National Air and Space Museum's YouTube channel. Thank you for watching us today. And ladies, thanks. This was a great conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.